In this portion of our video series, we're going to talk about how to load and unload any particular muzzleloader. First and foremost, we want to talk about indexing your ramrod. And indexing your ramrod, I mean you actually score the ramrod. I typically take my pocket knife or a flathead screwdriver, and we do this after we figured out what our muzzleloader prefers, aka which load, which projectile, which powder charge our muzzleloader prefers. And with this indexing mark, well, number one, we always know when we're loading the gun that we have the bullet seated all the way firmly against the face of the powder. And we can also confirm and reaffirm that we have not double loaded our gun. This index mark is very important in loading any muzzleloader that you take to the range and also while you're hunting. It's just a very quick way to reference and, number one, be super safe. I first want to talk about loading pelletized powder. Number one, because it's probably the most common powder charge used today in inline muzzleloaders. You get a pelletized box of powder, it's going to look something like this here. In most cases, it's going to be a 777, a Pyrodex, or a white hot pellet. White hot pellets are the most advanced of the pelletized powders. And I know this never happens, but I want to make sure that you understand. There's a pipe cleaner that looks like a number 7 or an L-shaped pipe cleaner that comes in these. The reason this is in there is so that you do not touch these powder charges with your fingertips. And I know you think, oh, well, I've cleaned my fingertips, I can just grab these and put them in. But what you don't understand is these pelletized pieces of powder here can actually pull the moisture and oil out of your fingertip, which will jeopardize your load. So always use the pipe cleaner to load just like this. And I'm gonna load here 2 pellets. Each pellet is 50 grains apiece, so this is a 100 grain charge. Probably the most common charge to use. All of the muzzleloaders that we manufacture today are Magnum guns, so they can shoot 150 grains of powder. But in my thinking and in my research and playing with pelletized powder, 100 grains typically is the most accurate load. And I'll give you the synopsis of, if your car can run 120 miles an hour, but typically it handles better at 65 miles an hour, a muzzleloading projectile is about the same way. Yes, you can run 150 grains of powder. You will get more muzzle velocity, you get more kinetic energy, but you tend to push that projectile too fast, which will eventually open up your group. So we're going to load this Optima here with 100 grains of pelletized powder, and that is 2 pellets. And basically what I do is I slide them in, touch the tip with my finger right there, and let them slide down. We're going to run a 330 grain Power Belt ELR. And of course, you see these guns are leaned up against the bench. I always want to make sure, especially when we get to the loose powder portion, make sure you bring your gun up 90 degrees to the earth. Then you can push your projectile in the barrel. And all of our muzzleloading barrels have a bore guiding portion of it, which is about the first 1/4 inch. There's no grooves and lands. That way you can actually load it with your fingertip. If you notice, I didn't take a loading tool or a T-handle to actually start this projectile. So I started with my fingertips, and then I take our ultimate CVA range rod. So as we're pushing our projectile down to seat it against the pelletized powder, so I've got it pushed all the way down now, and this ultimate range rod, I can set this jam nut system to go all the way down against the bore guide piece, which is this bottom portion right here. Jam nut this back together. This allows me to seat it at the same depth every time. But when you're loading pelletized powder, one thing that I want to make sure that you understand, and I know it's a common scenario of you push your projectile down and then you just lay on it to make sure that you got it seated. But what happens is with this pelletized powder, let me pull this out here and I'll kind of show you. With this pelletized powder, and it's pelletized because it is put together with binders to hold this powder together, the last thing you want to do is really seat your bullet hard against the face of these and actually break or crush these pelletized pieces, because if you do, what happens is it will jeopardize your load and then cause an inaccurate situation downrange. So when you push your projectile down, slow, steady until you feel a firm bottom, and that firm bottom is these pelletized powder here, or these hard powder pieces. So we've loaded our Optima. We've got our projectile lightly pressed against the 100 grains of 777 pellets. Now that we have it set, and I also have my ultimate range rod at the proper depth so we know we're always seated, we can pull this guy out. If you do not have one of the ultimate range rods, you will be loading with a standard range rod that I've indexed here. This will be how you load. Push down, and once you get all the way to your index mark, as the index mark sits just above the crown, then you know you have it seated all the way and you're safe to shoot. Now that we've talked about how to properly load the pelletized powder, I want to move on to the more modernized powder on the market today, which is Blackhorn 209. This is a loose powder. It is not available in pelletized, so you do have to measure this powder, and either that is measuring by a volumetric or a weighed version. Now keep in mind there are other loose powders on the market, Pyrodex and 777, but this is the most advanced powder on the market today, and these are the ones we recommend in our muzzleloaders now. But what we typically do is I always measure in a weight format, so I actually pour our Blackhorn 209 on the scale and get it to the exact 1/10 of grain. And one thing to remember about that, in muzzleloading, accuracy is always about consistency, and that means after every shot, swab the bore with a damp patch and dry patch, and it also means weighing out your powder to the 1/10 of grain. And I know that we advance quite a bit in the way we do things in muzzleloading. We always used to do it in a volumetric form, but today weighing it in or on a scale is by far the best way, and it gives you the most consistent load in any muzzleloader that you're shooting. What I typically do is measure these before I go on a hunt or before I come to the range, and I have our loading funnel here. So I'm going to load this guy here on the bench, and I want you to kind of pay attention to which way the gun is sitting. And what I mean by that is always when you're on the bench, the gun is going to be leaning against the bench. So the powder, as it goes down the barrel and lands in the powder column portion, the powder actually is sitting at an angle right now. So what I always want to make sure that you do, and again this goes back to consistency in muzzleloading, is make sure that you bring this gun up totally square, up and down vertical, tap the side of it to make sure that powder goes from this angle, then it levels out flat. Again, it's always about consistency and doing the same thing repetitive and every time identical. So now that we got our weighed Blackhorn 209 down in our powder column, again we take the 330 grain Power Belt ELR, push it down the bore guiding muzzle with our fingertips. Then we take our range rod, seat this guy here. Now what you see on the end here, this actually is a bore guide, and what we do is we're pushing this down. Instead of this range rod or your actual ramrod that comes with the gun, because they also make bore guides for them as well, but this here keeps this stainless steel rod from riding on the crown, which is where the most accuracy is. This portion of the barrel is the last portion of the barrel that your projectile sees, so you do not want to mess up the crown. This is the reason why we use this bore guide and why it's included on the ultimate range rod. But as I push this down, of course, I utilize this here in our Optima with pelletized powder, so I'm going to loosen this up. I'm going to slide this guy back up. And I've already shot this gun before this video series, so I know that this load is exactly what this gun prefers. So I'm going to push it down, all the way down till it seats against the face of the loose powder or the Blackhorn 209. Give it just a slight push, not a great lot, and then I can set my actual depth gauge here, now that I know where I'm going to be. But one thing that I want to make sure you also understand about loading loose powder. Now when I talked about the Optima, I talked about being very gentle and not crushing the pelletized powder because of load jeopardization. In this scenario here, you do want to give it just a little bit of push, or the ramrod a little bit of push on the projectile face. But you want to make sure that you try to remember and feel the amount of pressure that you put on this projectile. That way you have the same poundage of pressure pushing the powder together upon loading. And the reason I say that is, let's picture a firecracker. So if I was a very rambunctious kid, and this is not what I'm going to recommend doing, but I want to make sure that if you put a firecracker in the palm of your hand and you lay it here and you light it and it goes bang, it's probably going to burn the palm of your hand, but not going to hurt you real bad. But if you take that same firecracker, light it, and then you squeeze it, meaning you apply a lot of pressure to it, you're going to cause more pressure upon explosion. Then obviously you're going to be in bad shape, may lose a finger. That's the same scenario with loose powder. If you press one load down and seat it harder than the one you did before, you're going to have more chamber pressure, which is going to give you a different impact on your range. So always make sure when you seat the first one, make sure you keep the same applied pressure every time you load the gun. Again, a little bit repetitive, but I want to make sure you understand consistency in loading and shooting a muzzleloader is what's going to give you accuracy at the end of the day. But now we got these two guns loaded. Instead of sending them down range, which I'm going to here shortly, I want to talk about unloading these. So at the end of a hunt, say you're on a 5-day hunt somewhere other in the Midwest, and you come to the last day, it becomes dark and you didn't get to shoot the critter that you was after, you want to unload this gun before you pack it up and head back home. In this gun here in particular, with our QRBP and the pelletized powder, you actually can remove the QRBP, take your ramrod and just push everything out the back. That is your pelletized powder and your projectile. Once that's completed, you can put your QRBP or your breech plug back in place, and then you're good to go to head back home. So now as we move over to the Accurate LRX that we have loaded with loose Blackhorn 209, we always, again, like pelletized powder, we want to unload the gun before we head home from the trip or head home from the range. We want to make sure that we don't make a mistake that I've made several times in the past, and you know, that's how you learn from your mistakes. But in a case like this here, that you're running Blackhorn 209, the last thing you want to do is remove your breech plug and actually push the load and the projectile out to the back of the gun. Because what's going to happen is our QRBP, typically we have a little bit of breech plug grease on it, and that breech plug grease also is engaged in the threads at the bottom of the powder column, which creates a sticky factor. And then when you push that loose powder out the back of the barrel, all that loose powder is going to be stuck and engaged in those threads inside the barrel, which I may say is an absolute nightmare to get out. So what I typically try to do when I finish up a hunt, instead of dumping this out the back of the gun or pushing out the back of the gun like we do on this Optima with pelletized powder, I always want to make sure that I find a safe location, charge the gun, and then disarm it or fire it into a location to where I know it's a safe backdrop. That way that I don't have to worry about all the loose powder getting intertwined in the grease and the threads in the back of the breech plug. Now that we made our way through loading the two original style muzzleloaders, when I say original, I mean original style propellants, pelletized powder that we put in the Optima, and then the loose Blackhorn that we put in the Accurate LRX. And we've talked about a few times in this video series about how technology has touched everything. And in particular, the newest style muzzleloader that we manufacture today, we call the Crossfire. And it actually has a powder charge built in this fire stick capsule. This comes pre-measured. There's three different measures on the market today. There's 80, 100, and 120 grains of powder in these fire stick capsules. So to load a Crossfire, number one, you don't actually pour powder down the barrel, which is amazing. And I think at the end of the day, this is going to get a whole lot of new folks into the muzzleloading sport because they don't have to mess with pelletized or weighing and measuring loose powder. So to load our CVA Crossfire, basically we just take the muzzleloader, push our power belt ELR into the bore guiding muzzle, use our loading rod, push it all the way down. Now, we talked about in this series also that this portion of the barrel is your powder column. This gun here in particular has a shelf right above the powder column that we push this projectile down until it's a hard, firm stop. And we don't have to worry about overseating it, pushing it too hard, like we talked about doing in the loose powder. It actually is a hard shelf built into the stainless steel barrel. So we actually push the projectile down till it hits the shelf, and that projectile is considered loaded and seated. So now as we go through and finish up the loading process of the Crossfire, this is the greatest thing, and technology is awesome when it works, and I'm sure you agree with that. But we take our capsule here, this is a 100 grain charged capsule. We actually take it, put it in the back of the Crossfire. That's loaded, unloaded, repeat. Yes, this is pretty awesome. Loaded, unloaded. So we just take that capsule, push it in like that, lock it up, cock the hammer, and we're ready to go to work. So much easier way to get into muzzleloading, no measuring, super easy to clean up and super easy to unload at the end of the hunt or at the end of the range day. But that is a wrap up for this section of loading and unloading your CVA muzzleloaders. If you have any questions on anything that we're doing here today or any products that we utilize in the CVA lineup, you can go to CVA.com.